All right, and we are live. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. We are incredibly lucky to have an amazing collection of productive, pragmatic, bipartisan policymakers here to talk about, frankly, one of the most important and one of the very, very hardest topics in the entirety of the energy conversation, and the entirety of the clean energy conversation, and the entirety of the climate conversation. And that, of course, is reforming our outdated permitting systems so that we can actually build the clean energy that we need at the pace that we need to build it. My name is Rich Powell. I'm the CEO of ClearPath. We are very lucky to work with conservative policymakers to advance policies that accelerate deep decarbonization technologies that reduce and remove global energy emissions based in Washington, D.C. And I first want to give an enormous thanks to our friends at the Conservative Climate Foundation for bringing us all together here today, and our friends at the Atlantic Council for hosting us in this fantastic pavilion here at COP28 in Dubai. And what a COP it is. Just some quick thoughts about the scale and urgency of the challenge before we get over to the folks that you actually want to hear from. If we are serious about solving the climate challenge, if we are serious about building the kind of clean energy in the United States alone that we would need to support our decarbonizing ambitions, we're talking about building tens of thousands of new projects in the next 27 years. And we're about the end of this year, so let's call that 26 years. We're talking about building 10 to 15 projects a day. And that's across new clean electricity generating facilities, that's new pipelines of all kinds, carrying natural gas, carrying hydrogen, carrying CO2, carrying other advanced clean fuels. That's new minerals processing facilities and mines. That's 10 to 15 projects a day. A day. And every single one of those projects starts with the permit to build. Multiple permits to build. As many folks who have followed this issue closely in the US know, just a few quick statistics. The average environmental impact statement in the United States takes 4.5 years to process through the federal system. If the policy enacted over the last few years has its desired impact and greatly increases the number of projects that attempt to go through that system, we may have orders of magnitude more projects attempting to go through that same system that today already takes 5 years. The one thing we know about that system is the more projects that try to go through it, the slower it moves as a system. So clearly, we need to rethink this regime entirely. And so I'm very lucky that we have a number of policymakers here today who are taking that challenge seriously and have taken a number of steps already legislatively and are exploring new ones to move forward that policy regime and modernize that permitting process. So I am very, very happy to introduce, first, I'm going to go right down the line. I'm going to start with Representative Garrett Graves from the great state of Louisiana, who's a member of the T&I Committee in the U.S. House. Then we've got Representative Scott Peters from the great state of California, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Then John Curtis, representative from the great state of Utah, also a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And last but certainly not least, Representative Tim Walberg, the great state of Michigan, also a member of Energy and Commerce. So I'm going to start by going down the line, and I'd love for each of you, give us your high-level thoughts on what's at stake here, where we are today, and where you think we need to go next on the permitting challenge. Representative Graves, I'm going to turn it first to you.
Sure, thanks. Look, you can look at all sorts of statistics showing the work that needs to be done moving forward. There are some studies that show that we're going to have a tripling of electricity generation and transmission. Think about that for just a minute. A tripling with a process that, as Rich just mentioned, takes in excess of 4 years, has an average of 115 lawsuits a year, and generally takes about 2 years to settle a lawsuit, and over half of them are settled in the government's favor. This process is fundamentally broken. During the Jimmy Carter administration, the environmental impact statements were supposed to take 1 year, and today they're taking 4, and by the way, on a road project, it takes over 7 years today. So you simply don't have a process that's capable of delivering what is needed in order for us to achieve or to maximize efficiency, emissions reduction strategies, or even meeting the demand of energy that's projected moving forward. As we move forward, it's all about reliability, affordability, cleanliness of energy supply, exportability of technology, and security supply chain. Those 5 things, we cannot stop talking about them, but major issue is permitting. Last thing I'll say on this. Look, everybody's out there saying, I'm worried about the environment, I'm worried about the environment. I want to remind you, the majority of infrastructure projects that are carried out across America today do not have to follow a National Environmental Policy Act review because they are funded with private dollars, local or state funds that do not trigger a NEPA analysis. Yet we don't have a destroyed environment because there's an inherent desire within the public for us to protect the environment today.
Fantastic.
Hi, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks, Rich, for your help. I'm the reason you have a bipartisan panel today. Oh, look, there's a couple. No, we don't have to do that here. I completely agree with what Garrett just said, and I was proud to support the infrastructure bill and the IRA. But Princeton tells us that if we don't, for instance, expand transmission greatly, we're going to lose 80% of the climate benefit of the IRA. So our work is not done, and now our job is speed. If you think about the environmental movement in the 1970s, what was that about? It was about stopping us from making mistakes. We were making a lot of mistakes, chewing up coastal wetlands, polluting, whatever. We said, okay, government, before you do that anymore, before you can make a decision, you have to know all the environmental impacts of what you're doing, and you have to consider the alternatives, and that seemed like a good idea at the time, still seems like a good idea. I actually practiced environmental law, tried to do permitting, and went through a lot of this with clients who said, this is taking a long time. And by the way, I have to spend every month on my loan. I'm not getting any benefit from it. There's huge cost to this. If you're going to tell me no, just tell me no now. And so I came up with the motto that no is the second best answer. But it's not just that. It's not just the inconvenience of doing this, but the results are terrible. And just on interregional transmission, for instance, Garrett was saying how much we have to build out. I'd say it's about 200,000 miles of transmission lines we have to build. At the rate we're going now, 1,800 a year. 1,800 a year. We say we want to compete with other countries. We built, since 2014, in North America, built 12 gigawatts of interregional transmission lines. 12. About half of it was us. Actually, it was 7. About half was us. So say the United States was 4, okay? Just for frame of reference. The comparable number in South America is 22. The comparable number in Europe is 44. And in China, 260. We can't compete, we can't win, we can't solve the climate crisis without getting out of our own way. We have to make radical changes to this permit system. And environmentalists should be leading the way, and so far that's not the case. But we're gonna get some bipartisan action in Congress, I believe.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm going to pick up where he left off. So he's the lone Democrat on this panel, but can we just have this moment? We're at Cobb, and we have 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat on the panel. Usually, I'm used to being the lone Republican, and this is my 3rd trip to COP, so it's really great to be with you. And what an important topic. So just a couple of things on permitting reform. There are few things in Washington that are as bipartisan as permitting reform. There are a few things in Washington where we're as far apart as we are on permitting reform to getting an answer. It just seems to be elusive. Although everybody wants to do it, it just seems to be elusive. And let me just make a point here. So in my district in Utah, I have about 80% of my geography, 90% of it is owned by the federal government. If you think it's difficult to permit on non-federal government, imagine permitting on federal government property. We have a case where it took 9 years to permit broadband going in an existing right-of-way on public property. So I'm just telling you, the orders of magnitude of this is huge. And going back to the IRA, to Scott's point, when they did the IRA, the Congressional Budget Office didn't charge the IRA with all the dollars that were spent because they said those dollars cannot be spent because of permitting reform. That just shows you the difficulty of the task. So delighted to be here. This is a really important conversation, and I'll pass to my gentleman on the left.
Delighted to be here as well. And again, this is the largest bipartisan congressional co-del that we've ever had. It's amazing. Scott can say he's the token Democrat here on our panel. I'm the token Northerner with a #1 football team in the land. Go Blue. Hey, that's environmental. And that takes permitting. We don't even have a coach on the field most of the time. So, hey, I'm privileged to represent a district that goes from Lake Michigan on my west to Lake Erie, 2 of the 5 Great Lakes in my district. No salt, no biting fish in any of those lakes. On both of those extremes in my district, on Lake Erie, I have Fermi Nuclear Plant. On the west side, I have Cook Nuclear Plant, both generating significant power, both needing updatings, but because of permitting challenges, I know Fermi has already said they probably never will have that opportunity because it will be too costly to do. That has to change. Just north of my Cook plant, on Lake Michigan as well, is the Palisades Nuclear Plant. It's been decommissioned. Fortunately, a company bought it. They want to put it back into operation with advanced nuclear reactors. They're in the process of doing that. We need that power now, as our state government has decided we are going to get out of fossil fuels. We want to go to all renewables by 2030. It's not going to happen. But in the meantime, we need stable power. One thing with permitting that I look at, not the minds of these 3 preceding me on this issue yet, but it has to be predictable, it has to be realistic, and it has to be affordable. And the permitting process at this point in time isn't. As we see what's taking place, whether it's with my nuclear plants or Line 5, bringing across propane and natural gas from Canada to the United States and back to Canada, stopping over in the United States in a good partnership agreement, just getting the permit to put a new Line 5 in that'll protect the Great Lakes forever, putting in a tunnel itself underneath the base of the lake has been up until this time almost impossible. Those are the challenges we face. We have the know-how to do what we need. We just need the permitting process that, again, is affordable, it's realistic, and most importantly, it's predictable.
So important, and especially your point on the interlinkage between the permitting system and the cost. You know, on average, every year of delay is another 20% cost, right? So round numbers, that's 5 years, double the cost, right?
It becomes real money, even in government terms.
Yeah. And thank you as well for invoking nuclear. The entirety of the last panel was on nuclear, so I'm not going to let us go deep down that. But I do think it's worth celebrating that this is very much the nuclear COP. It's been an enormous amount of progress and announcement here on nuclear energy and global prospects for nuclear as well. Congressman Graves, I'm going to come back to you. So can you walk us
about
through
Congressman Wahlberg's football comment?
What's that? We can also litigate that. So this year, working with Speaker McCarthy and bipartisan work in the House, you passed the debt ceiling deal, which included permitting reform measures, which were part of your H.R. 1 bill. Can you tell us a little bit about H.R. 1 and how it addressed permitting reform? Tell us what went into the permitting deal, and tell us what's happened since then as that implementation has begun.
Sure. So first of all, we started working with a very diverse group of interests, and I want to be clear, these are people that are in the regulated community, people that have had to go through NEPA and other things in the past and kind of took all the lessons learned, and we put together a bill called the Builder Act. Builder Act was included in H.R. 1. That was our big energy package that passed the House of Representatives later this year. In May, we started negotiating debt ceiling with the White House. As part of those negotiations, we introduced NEPA reform to those negotiations, and we made significant headway. I'm going to estimate that perhaps 60% of the Builder Act was included and became law in the Fiscal Responsibility Act or debt ceiling. That included things like raising the threshold for when NEPA applies. Current standards is the first penny of federal funds. You can have a $1 trillion project. If it has 1 penny of federal funds, all of a sudden NEPA applies, federal standards apply. So we raised that threshold. Number 2, we limited the scope of the NEPA review to reasonably foreseeable impacts instead of just saying anything that could possibly happen under any scenario. Number 3, we limited it on environmental assessment, 1 year, 75 pages. An environmental impact statement, not 4 years, as Rich just said, not 7 years as in a transportation project, 2 years and 150 pages. We expanded the use of categorical exclusions across agencies. Whenever you have a project that's of a known type and impacts, you can get a categorical exclusion or expand the use of it from a sister agency. We codified in federal law 1 federal decision. You can imagine trying to operate by committee. You have Corps of Engineers, EPA, National Marine Fisheries Service, NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, all these different resource agencies that are at the table, and everyone's in charge. You can't make a decision. You have U.S. Fish who's arguing about what happens with freshwater fish. You have National Marine Fisheries Service arguing about what happens in saltwater. Neither one of them can come to an agreement. You've got to have a decision maker, so we codified that. All sorts of reforms or changes. These are in law today, and really excited about that. However, in the draft rules that the White House has put together, they completely trashed, and I want to be clear, completely trashed the agreement that we had made in those negotiations. Went in and basically, I'm going to say, ignored the deadlines we put in place. And they changed the time for when the clock starts ticking to hit the 1 year or the 2 years. They introduced some climate and environmental justice provisions that create very, very vague conditions under which you could see rejection, you could see scoping go well beyond what was intended. A number of things that they've done in their draft rules that were wholly inconsistent with the 4 corners of the agreement that we made. That was a very, very in-depth negotiation that went on for an extended period of time. There was complete clarity in our discussions in terms of what the agreement is. So we are trying to push back on White House right now to get them back within the 4 corners of the agreement that we actually had in the Fiscal Responsibility Act negotiations.
Would anyone else like to weigh in? Please. Representative
So I
Peters.
want to say I really feel Garrett's pain. As an environmentalist, we are losing sight of the big picture, which is that 90% of the projects in the queue are non-polluting. 90%. So if you're in any business or you're dealing with any transaction or even with your children, you're going to give up 10 to get 90, right? And we Democrats are getting on our own way. What Garrett did was remarkable in the context of legislating, but minuscule in the context of the climate challenge. I mean, we're still talking about processing 60,000 projects. And remember, 90% of them clean. We're entirely in the way of that progress. And so I think that we have to go a lot further than what we've done already. And it should be the climate action advocates should be leading this, not getting in the way of that. Unfortunately, we're ass backwards right now. It's just not that way. And I'm just trying to say, look at the facts. If you really want to decarbonize that much in 30 years, we have to go on offense. We have to get out of our own way. And I think what Garrett did, the way people squawked about it from the left was remarkable. And we really need to talk back against that. If you care about this planet, you got to get the process out of the way. We have the money. That's what we used to worry about, right? We have the money. We got to get it out of the bank.
More thoughts on this one? Well, I want to follow up maybe on something you just mentioned. So this idea of, if we grapple with this 60,000 projects, right? How could we possibly move that through the queue? We do have this other tool, and you mentioned it. So technically, in the U.S. context, it's called categorical exclusions, or we could rename that tool. But the basic idea is, as members of Congress, you can say what these statutes apply to and what they don't apply to. And so in the past couple of decades, we've applied this, I think, quite successfully twice permanently for oil and gas leasing on federal lands in 2005 in a period of energy crisis, and temporarily for solar on public lands in 2009 to help spur the industrial solar industry. Both of those have worked reasonably well. right? And we don't have all those projects going into the queue. And so, whatever you want to call this, categorical exclusions, it's pre-clearance, right? It's legislative clearance of projects. Do we think this could be in the cards? I mean, we know it works. Obviously, it's hard. It requires Congress to take a lot of heat because you've got to make the decisions. It's not delegated to the administration. You got to make the decisions. Do you think it's possible? Can we do more of these? Is that in the cards? Anyone would like to discuss?
I'm gonna be the warm-up for Garrett here on this question. Listen, when I went to Congress, one of my biggest aha moments was it's hard to pass legislation, even really good legislation. And we literally see bills that will have hundreds of co-sponsors not even come up for a vote. And I think it just shows you the difficulty of the task. And then you layer on top of that just the complexities of what's happening right now in the House with leadership and even just trying to get a budget done. And so I don't want to be gloom and doom on it, but it does mean to me, like, we have to be laser focused. We have to be very bipartisan, and we've got to get leadership right on board what we're doing. And that's, here again, going back to what Garrett did, that's why it was so remarkable what he did. But we're in an environment where even good legislation doesn't even come up for a vote.
Let me be a little bit more optimistic if I could. So the Aspen Institute did this really great study that was led by Jim Connaughton, who was CEQ under W, and Katie McGinty, who was CEQ under Clinton. And they sort of looked at this issue and what could they do. And they came up with 4 really good ideas. One and two were to give preference basically to places that were already disturbed. If you were working on a brownfield, for instance, why not accelerate the approval there, do pre-clearance for things there? If it's a technology you understand, for God's sakes, are we really going to argue about the environmental disadvantages of a solar utility project? Maybe that's something you would accelerate, because it seems like the legislature and the president have decided that that's a policy we want to pursue. Third, figure out some way to get state and locals on board. A lot of this drag isn't just at the federal level, although we could set a good example by doing permit reform. It still has to happen at the state level. And fourth, you got to go after NEPA litigation. Even if you left NEPA as it is, it's not just the preparation of the documents, but it's afterward. This is what I used to do. It's afterward. It takes years to litigate NEPA, and often what it goes back and they send it back to have a review redone, and it comes back to the court. There's ways to make that a lot faster. Why shouldn't that be 120 days process instead of years? And those are all really good ideas I think we should pursue. And I think everyone's got to climb the fence and jump off together. But I just want to give you a quote from that study. Their conclusion was that achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is ecologically essential, technologically feasible, economically achievable, but procedurally impossible. And that's where we are.
Let me just jump in here with something. I've just heard recently there's potentially a new technology coming out called AI or something.
Can you say more about that?
I'd have to kill you if I told you. No, I'm thinking about this. We have good work that's been done. We've got plenty of precedent. I think we need to think outside of the box. If indeed Congress is cumbersome, if indeed the bureaucracy is even more cumbersome, sometimes if it's the private sector, citizenry, etc., that can be cumbersome in accepting something not in my backyard, as it were, with permitting. We have a tool that's coming out with AI. We're dealing with that in Energy and Commerce Committee. But this is something looking at the future of saying, how do we rush these permits? Because I think it has to be rushed. It has to be predictable. It has to be realistic. It has to be affordable. We've got bases of knowledge and information. We've got past history of what's necessary to look at. And I think tools like AI and others could be very helpful in moving forward. And maybe at COP we ought to be talking about some of those things too.
Yeah, I just want to point out too that not in all cases, but in some cases, when we say no, we're forcing that overseas to conditions that we don't control at all. And we've all seen, the pictures and things like that of human rights violations, and imagine the emissions. There's no emissions controls, no OSHA controls. So when we say no at home in pursuit of perfection, a lot of times we're just pushing that someplace else that we have zero control.
And I'll just double click on that point. Even domestically, we say, well, we have an environmental justice problem. You know, it's often those communities that don't have the resources to sort of, you know, use all these procedural processes, and so that's why we have an environmental justice problem. Yes. Do you want to come back to the adjudication point?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Congressman Peters brought up this litigation issue. And under current law, you can wait 6 years after your report's issued, your environmental documents are done, and you can file lawsuits. There's nothing that requires people to actually participate within the NEPA framework. And so under the Builder Act, what we did is we actually said that the only way you have standing to file litigation is if you first try and participate in the public participation process. And if your goal is truly to resolve your issue, try and resolve it within NEPA. There is much public participation framework there. So after you engage in the public participation under the bill we wrote, if you're unable to resolve it there, you then have 120 days after documents are filed in order to file your litigation. Not 6 years, but 120 days. And once again, the only way you have standing is if you first try and work out through the public participation process. I think that's a really good model. In our negotiations with the White House, I will tell you, we came very close to getting to a compromise on judicial review, not as aggressive as what I just noted, but we came really close. We ultimately just ran out of time. But as Congressman Peters said, I think this is a key point of the next phase of reform that we're going to be working on. And it's not just me saying, it's not just John Kerry saying it. Scott Peters saying it. We just left a meeting with John Kerry, where John Kerry even said it. I know. Indistinguishable, Scott. But John Kerry said it in a meeting we had with him just a little while ago. So this is a very widely held belief, or it's something we all acknowledge is a major problem within NEPA. Of course, many other things, but that one certainly is fundamental.
Rich, can I just
Please
use this opportunity to point out the problem of capital? Imagine going to investors and saying, look, I've got a really good project, and it's going to pencil. Oh yeah, by the way, historically, every project like this is sued for 10 years, so you now have to add 10 years. You can see why capital is going to run from this, which is a huge problem.
And you see, there are lots of reasons that it's been a challenging year to build wind in the U.S. There was an announcement just this morning that in the whole third quarter of this year, we added 288 megawatts, so that's about one wind farm, in the whole third quarter of this year. And that's not entirely due to this permitting process. Lots of capital is expensive, things are hard right now, but the permitting process has just been really, really savage, especially to these offshore wind projects. Some of them have gone through, to your point, 4 different NEPA suits for the Vineyard Wind project alone. It's been, it's really kills the economics of a lot of these projects. So I'm hearing a lot of violent agreement on this stage, which is a good thing, that we need to do something about this. Can we all talk a level higher about, what the contours of a deal on this might be from y'all's perspective, and how we actually get there? Congressman Peters, I'd love your perspective on how many fellow Democrats you think might come along for a deal like this. And for everyone, I'd love your perspectives on how many more folks you think could come to this, and how you think we actually get there.
I'm happy to answer this. It's sort of Garrett's turn to answer this question, but I'll take a shot at it. I think there is a real concern among Democrats about transmission, expanding transmission. It's seen as, it is foundational to building out a clean energy transition. I think we have not done enough work to make folks from places like Louisiana understand why it's important in general for reliability. The amount of load we're going to have, growth is going to require us to build a better grid. We want to build a better grid, a more secure grid. We need to get everyone on board on that and get some real relief around siting. Make sure you can cite lines about cost allocation, which is sort of generally understood, but probably needs some more specifics. John Hickenlooper and I have the Big Wires Act, which is a minimum transfer requirement, which would provide some duty of each region to be able to move electricity. I think there are some issues around oil and gas that need to be resolved. I think that those kind of have to go with transmission, and I'd let Garrett talk about more what he's interested in that. And then I think we're all interested in permit reform. I think no one is interested in this long litigation for any project. I think that should, that's a really matter of convincing some of the environmental groups that NEPA was not written by Moses, on tablets. I mean, really, the reaction you get to this is really, it's like, how dare you even touch NEPA, even though really the goal is to protect the environment. And all of a sudden, this is in the way of us playing offense on that ground. And then I do think we have to do something about the volume of projects that we have. We have to come up with some pre-clearance mechanism that doesn't require us to be looking at each one of these individually, particularly when they're each well understood. So I think that's kind of where it's going to go. I do want to say that in particular, these two gentlemen to my right and left have been really important in this, along with Bruce Westerman. And I want to congratulate John because he did create the Conservative Climate Caucus in Congress. When I came in, I think we often rightly accused Republicans of being deniers. I mean, John has 80-some, a third of all House Republicans who've declared that climate change is happening. It's driven by human activity. That's a huge place a huge movement for that group. And I think John deserves a lot of credit for putting that together. Now I'm like tapping my foot. There we go. Now I'm tapping my foot and saying, okay, John, what are we going to do with all those people? Let's pass some laws.
Can I ask you about the gas portion of this deal? Right. So. Oh, sorry. Actually, yeah. Start. You want to start there?
Yeah. Look, I think that what Congressman Peters brought up in terms of contours makes a lot of sense. So I'll run through kind of my list. One, I think judicial review is critical. And anytime I'm saying something and John Kerry's saying it, that seems like maybe there's a deal in there. I agree with him that I think that transmission is something that we need to be working on. I think EV charging stations is another one that we need to be talking about. I think 401 certification on pipelines is something that we need to look at and help to clarify what the law truly intended. I think that if we're going to be realistic and truly apply math and science to the equation, then as Congressman Peters said, we do need to be looking at oil and gas because, and I want to be really clear on this, because the Biden administration's EIA says that we're going to have a 42% increase in oil demand globally. The Biden administration's EIA says we're going to have a 57% increase, yes, globally in natural gas. And so if that's the case, and if these are Biden administration figures, we need to make sure we're getting them from the place that have the lowest carbon intensity. Where is that? It would happen to be the Gulf of Mexico. And so making sure that we're being thoughtful about strategies moving forward. Looking at things like, I think as part of this discussion, what is your critical mineral load? What do you need for refining and processing of those? Where is that going to come from? We have resources in the United States. What is the strategy there? That needs to be part of this discussion. Again, this is math and science. And one other thing I'll add that you didn't bring up, and I'm curious about your thoughts on it, is looking at a surrogate process or perhaps a delegation scenario. I said earlier, the majority of projects carried out across America today do not go through NEPA, do not go through a federal review. So is there something we can do to allow for a surrogate process by state or local governments that can suffice or cover the base for NEPA in a way to kind of expand capacity? Because both Rich and Congressman Peters have talked about this surge of projects. So can we use other outlets to help to address those? So that's kind of my list.
Just because we're about to finish off our deal on permitting reform here, right in this audience, I'll just
I
add
hope
that
everyone is taking notes.
on the state and local side, there's sort of two approaches. One is the more draconian, which says unless you have permitting laws that are at least as fast as ours, your permitting laws don't apply. We just actually preempt it. The other is to do what you do with highways and say unless you do this, this, and this, we're not giving you federal money. At least we could do that, I think, but we haven't taken that. I have not tried to take that on yet. That seems to be really the local control issue. You tell me if I'm wrong. Seems to be a little bit of a harder sell among Republicans right now. By the way, Florida would be a lot better at changing its laws than California to make things go faster. But so I'd be happy to kick California in the pants that way.
I think that, just to answer your question real quick, I think that the local control issue, it's something that's doable, but again, just like our problem with 401 certification, you got to put the right parameters in place.
Yeah, I'm going to speak up as a former mayor here and talk about local control. There is some concern with local control that you don't want to take away from a city their right to dictate how their city grows and where they zone certain projects and where they don't zone certain projects. So I get a little nervous if the federal government's going to come in and say you can't not allow a project in a place in the city where you don't want that project. At the same time, I get it. Cities and counties and states need to understand this has to go someplace. So there's got to be a balance between local control and needs that have to happen.
And I'll just observe that in some instances, we've been talking about general permitting here. There are some instances, so CO2 sites, for example, we're going to put it CO2 underground, where states appear to be better situated in many ways than the EPA to issue those permits. So we have a process where a state can take primacy of that. And I think in some cases where the states are better situated, it appears that it could work faster. It appears. Can we come back to the gas part of this? And so to your point about the U.S. role in global decarbonization and all this, obviously we've got parts of the country where we have abundant gas, very low cost gas, and it's effectively boxed in by sort of complete opposition to pipelines and complete blockage of pipelines. Do you think you mentioned the 401 fix? Are there other pieces there that would sort of enable more LNG exports or more use of gas as part of this?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Or more use of carbon capture as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me just go back very quickly on the whole local, state, and all that stuff. All right, so do a little remedial here. So first of all, just on the local, state, all that stuff. Look, one, if you're talking about a project that goes all across the state and goes into 3 different states and all that, no, obviously you can't put a local or state government in charge of it because it's going to cross over multiple states. So that you got to have the right parameters in place. Secondly, 401 fix, Scott's asked me to clarify that. Under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, states have the ability to effectively comment on water quality certification. What's happened is that in recent years, states have weaponized this as a way to pick project winners and losers. They've come in on projects that they don't want to happen, like, for example, an interstate gas pipeline, and said, oh, no, this isn't consistent with our water quality. Well, they're using it as a weapon. It was not what Congress intended. And so our fix would basically, which, by the way, we've done this out of committee and through the House a few times, just hadn't become law yet, but it would basically limit a state's sort of authority in this case to truly adversely affecting water quality and not using it as a weapon to pick project winners and losers. What's the last thing I'm supposed to? Oh, so gas, so stranded gas projects. So look, this is something that's absolutely critical. We sit here and we talk about emissions reduction. Let me give you a number. I'm always floored by this figure. You're all familiar with Russia and invading Ukraine. If we had simply taken 1 year of Russian gas that was being supplied to the European Union and supplanted it with U.S. gas, it would have reduced emissions 218 million tons in a single year. Think about that for just a minute. All these strategies we're doing, and we're trying to reduce emissions by tens of thousands of tons or hundreds of thousands of tons. This one action would reduce emissions 218 million tons every year. It would have kneecapped Vladimir Putin from a monetary perspective. It would have taken that leverage away that he had over the European Union. I mean, just win, 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 win. And so we cannot, and here at this COP, they're talking about phasing out fossil fuels and all this kind of stuff. Look, that's fine as long as we're doing it in a way that is actually based upon the math and science and makes sense. But I think it's a mistake for us to be simply targeting energy sources and not staying focused on the emissions. It's a flawed strategy. So what needs to happen in regard to these stranded assets? If we have the lowest intensity gas in the world, or some of the lowest intensity carbon intensity gas in the world, we should not be limiting or stranding these assets. It is better for the global environment for us to actually connect this to the grid. and actually for us to be able to export it, which means we need to be permitting more LNG export capacity, and it means that we need to be allowing for pipelines to be built to transport this clean source out of around the United States and potentially to export sources as well. And of course, we need to continue working on projects like carbon capture storage and others to help to complement that in terms of the emissions footprint.
Very responsive. Very responsive. All right. I think we're starting to run short on time. Mr. Wahlberg, I want to come back to one thing you mentioned earlier. So we talked a little bit, we're talking technology specific now. Coming back to nuclear on the technology specific side. Clearly, permitting with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, permitting in and around nuclear has been a challenge. I know on the committee, y'all have taken action, I think just in the last week, on a number of pieces of legislation, some of which included some NRC modernization and reform proposals. I wonder if you could just give us your thoughts on, how do we get the permitting, the technology-specific permitting piece of the puzzle right for nuclear energy?
Well, I think we took a good whack at it last week with the bills we brought out of committee. 44 bills in that markup, and some of them contained the nuclear regulatory reform.
And then you got on a plane and came here, so it's been a busy.
Got on a plane,
it's been a busy week.
Yeah. I think what we're looking at is a history of safety and security within our nuclear industry. We've got ships, submarines going all over that have been safe. We've got a history here in the United States of safe actors with our nuclear power plants, including, as I said, 2 in Michigan right now that are still operating. We need to find a way by which we can look at what's needed, what has been learned already, how we can run permitting processes parallel without plopping on top of each other one after another, but run them alongside to give hope, to give that predictability, that investment opportunity that continues to go in to make this, which doesn't cause any real problems that we have, is the closest thing to renewable resource and provides the base load power that we need. In Michigan, solar, wind have their place, but we don't have that much sun. And so to have something that is certain as nuclear power, to make sure that the regulatory regime that's in place allows us to not only keep, but update, but then expand, would be the way to go.
I wonder if I can ask all of you one last question, and I'd love all of your thoughts on this. How do you actually see, we've heard a lot about the policy pillars that could be part of a grand bargain around this, a big deal around this. Obviously, it would need to cover a lot of things, what these laws apply to, how they're decided and adjudicated, what we do on transmission, what we do on pipelines, what we do on mines, what we do on these technology-specific things. So a lot in this package. How do we actually get there? What do you see as the prospects for moving forward further on this? The remainder of this Congress? Is this we do much more of this Congress, but then this really sets things up for a deal in the next Congress? It sounds like we have support from this administration, maybe to move something next year. How do you see this moving forward? Handicap for us, whether we're going to have a great big ambitious permitting reform deal in the next 12 and a half months or next Congress.
Yeah, sure. So one, look, this is absolutely doable. It is, and I want to thank Congressman Peters for being really thoughtful and beginning to put some ideas together on what this looks like. I think what needs to happen is that we need to have a bipartisan group that is meeting on a regular basis to talk through this, to talk through what is actually doable from our perspectives. I think we're going to have to spend part of our time educating people, because I do feel like this is one of those issues that is somewhat Greek, and as Congressman Peters has said, NEPA is viewed as one of those, and I'll use a nuclear term, sort of. It's just kind of radioactive, almost, where you don't touch this. It's one of those sacrosanct things. You don't ever touch it. I want to remind you.
Not that radioactivity is bad. It's good and useful.
I know.
It's good and useful.
But we did 25 pages of law changes to NEPA just 6 months ago. So this veil has already been pierced. We're already making changes to it. But we've got to educate people and stay focused on better environmental outcomes. And I think that we can all sit down and work that out. So I think a bipartisan working group is the best way to move forward on this, and just make sure we're being really thoughtful about a balanced approach.
I think, yeah, good. I like that.
And we'll
Of
see
course,
if
it's
everybody
based
can get an
entirely
applause
Hope you'll-
line. We'll see
hope you'll
if-
Based
invite me to
entirely
be on
upon
it.
a list that I put
That's
together.
Yeah.
I think two things. One is I think what Garrett said before about concentrating on what the emissions are, like that's what we're after. We're after emissions reduction, right? So no sacred cows under that. I mean, if that means that natural gas can fill part of that, I got to be willing to do that. If that means that NEPA has to be changed because of the timelines, we have to be willing to do that. And I know that the Republicans claim to be all of the above. I know that they're going to facilitate that as well. But it's about getting to the emissions level. That's where the truth is going to come out. That's where the facts are going to come out. The other thing is it has to be bipartisan. This sort of goes without saying. You need 60 votes in the Senate to do anything. You need 218 in the House. You need a presidential signature. And so, I just think that the notion that Democrats can do it by themselves is easy thinking, but not good work. And I'm certainly committed to doing that. And if you'll invite me to be on your secret panel, I'll be on it. Thanks to everyone for having me, by the way.
I wonder where the secret panel could begin meeting. I wonder.
So not long ago, there was a book that was very famous that said, good is the enemy of great. And I actually think great is also the enemy of good. And sometimes we try to legislate to perfection. And I think at some point, as members of Congress, we need to realize, look, this bar is good. And instead of walking away from all of it, we've got to do that. So my warning to all of us up here is this concept of, look, let's get a good permitting bill and not give up because it's not perfect.
And I jump on everything these guys have said already, as you might expect, being clean up here. But I think this morning in a bilateral meeting that we had with one of our partner countries, when asked the question about their use of the fossil fuels, which was significant because of their country and the setting they had, said, what is your number one concern? Emissions. Just came out straight, just like we've said here. We need to make sure our countries, and in our case, the United States, understands that we have a common goal, Democrat, Republican, reducing emissions for the good of our country, for the good of our future, but then do it in such a way, because of investments that are needed, we need that reliability, that affordability, and that predictability. If we can get that message out to our constituents, and I think from the ground up, pretty soon the local mayors, the states, and our federal offices can work together if we have the common goal of emissions reduction and doing it in a way that makes sense. I think we can do it.
Inspiring words. Thank you all so much for all of these ideas and insights and optimism. And I'm excited to hear prospects are possible for this very soon. I again want to thank the wonderful organizers of this at the Conservative Climate Foundation. We've got Chair Heather Reams here in the room. And I absolutely want to thank again the Atlantic Council for hosting this fantastic gathering and this fantastic series of conversations here this afternoon. Thank you all so much again for coming and nerding out with all of us on permitting reform. And now we'll move on to the next session.